Chapter 33 of A Short History of the World by H. G. Wells. The Growth of the Roman Empire. Now this new Roman power, which arose to dominate the Western world in the 2nd and 1st centuries B.C., was in several respects a different thing from any of the great empires that had hitherto prevailed in the civilized world. It was not at first a monarchy, and it was not the creation of any one great conqueror. It was not indeed the first of republican empires. Athens had dominated a group of allies and dependents in the times of Pericles, and Carthage, when she entered upon her fatal struggle with Rome, was mistress of Sardinia and Corsica, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and most of Spain and Sicily. But it was the first republican empire that escaped extinction and went on to fresh developments. The center of this new system lay far to the west of the more ancient centers of empire, which had hitherto been the river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt. This westward position enabled Rome to bring into civilization quite fresh regions and peoples. The Roman power extended to Morocco and Spain, and was presently able to thrust northwestward over what is now France and Belgium to Britain, and northeastward into Hungary and South Russia. But on the other hand, it was never able to maintain itself in Central Asia or Persia, because they were too far from its administrative centers. It included, therefore, great masses of fresh Nordic Aryan-speaking peoples. It presently incorporated nearly all the Greek people in the world, and its population was less strongly Hamitic and Semitic than that of any preceding empire. For some centuries this Roman Empire did not fall into the grooves of precedent that had so speedily swallowed up Persian and Greek, and all that time it developed. The rulers of the Medes and Persians became entirely Babylonized in a generation or so. They took over the tiara of the King of Kings and the temples and priesthoods of his gods. Alexander and his successors followed in the same easy path of assimilation. The Seleucid monarchs had much the same court and administrative methods as Nebuchadnezzar. The Ptolemies became pharaohs and altogether Egyptian. They were assimilated, just as before them the Semitic conquerors of the Sumerians had been assimilated. But the Romans ruled in their own city, and for some centuries kept to the laws of their own nature. The only people who exercised any great mental influence upon them before the 2nd or 3rd century A.D. were the kindred and similar Greeks. So that the Roman Empire was essentially a first attempt to rule a great dominion upon mainly Aryan lines. It was so far a new pattern in history. It was an expanded Aryan republic. The old pattern of a personal conqueror ruling over a capital city that had grown up round the temple of a harvest god did not apply to it. The Romans had gods and temples, but like the gods of the Greeks, their gods were quasi-human immortals, divine patricians. The Romans also had blood sacrifices and even made human ones in times of stress, things they may have learned to do from their dusky Etruscan teachers. But until Rome was long past its zenith, neither priest nor temple played a large part in Roman history. The Roman Empire was a growth, an unplanned, novel growth. The Roman people found themselves engaged, almost unawares, in a vast administrative experiment. It cannot be called a successful experiment. In the end, their empire collapsed altogether, and it changed enormously in form and method from century to century. It changed more in 100 years than Bengal or Mesopotamia or Egypt changed in 1,000. It was always changing. It never attained to any fixity. In a sense, the experiment failed. In a sense, the experiment remains unfinished, and Europe and America today are still working out the riddles of worldwide statescraft first confronted by the Roman people. It is well for the student of history to bear in mind the very great changes, not only in political, but in social and moral matters, that went on throughout the period of Roman dominion. There is much too strong a tendency in people's minds to think of the Roman rule as something finished and stable, firm, rounded, noble, and decisive. Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome, CPQR, the elder Cato, the Scipios, Julius Caesar, Diocletian, Constantine the Great, triumphs, orations, gladiatorial combats, and Christian martyrs are all mixed up together in a picture of something high and cruel and dignified. The items of that picture have to be disentangled. They are collected at different points from a process of change profounder than that which separates the London of William the Conqueror from the London of today. We may very conveniently divide the expansion of Rome into 4 stages. The first stage began after the sack of Rome by the Goths in 390 BC and went on until the end of the First Punic War, 240 BC. We may call this stage the stage of the assimilative republic. It was perhaps the finest, most characteristic stage in Roman history. The age-long dissensions of patrician and plebeian were drawing to its close. The Etruscan threat had come to an end. No one was very rich, yet nor very poor, and most men were public-spirited. It was a republic, like the republic of the South African Boers before 1900, or like the northern states of the American Union between 1800 and 1850, a free farmers' republic. At the outset of this stage, Rome was a little state scarcely 20 miles square. She fought the sturdy but kindred states about her, and sought not their destruction, but coalescence. Her centuries of civil dissension had trained her people in compromise and concessions. Some of the defeated cities became altogether Roman, with a voting share in the government. Some became self-governing, with the right to trade and marry in Rome. Garrisons full of citizens were set up at strategic points, and colonies of varied privileges founded among the freshly conquered people. Great roads were made. The rapid Latinization of all Italy was the inevitable consequence of such a policy. In 89 BC, all the free inhabitants of Italy became citizens of the city of Rome. Formally, the whole Roman Empire became at last an extended city. In 212 AD, every free man in the entire extent of the empire was given citizenship, the right, if he could get there, to vote in the town meeting in Rome. This extension of citizenship to tractable cities and whole countries was the distinctive device of Roman expansion. It reversed the old process of conquest and assimilation altogether. By the Roman method, the conquerors assimilated the conquered. But after the First Punic War and the annexation of Sicily, though the old process of assimilation still went on, another process arose by its side. Sicily, for instance, was treated as a conquered prey. It was declared an estate of the Roman people. Its rich soil and industrious population was exploited to make Rome rich. The patricians and the more influential among the plebeians secured the major share of that wealth, and the war also brought in a large supply of slaves. Before the First Punic War, the population of the Republic had been largely a population of citizen farmers. Military service was their privilege and liability. While they were on active service, their farms fell into debt, and a new large-scale slave agriculture grew up. When they returned, they found their produce in competition with slave-grown produce from Sicily and from the new estates at home. Times had changed. The Republic had altered its character. Not only was Sicily in the hands of Rome, the common man was in the hands of the rich creditor and the rich competitor. Rome had entered upon its second stage, the Republic of adventurous rich men. For 200 years the Roman soldier farmers had struggled for freedom and a share in the government of their state. For 100 years they had enjoyed their privileges. The First Punic War wasted them and robbed them of all they had won. The value of their electoral privileges had also evaporated. The governing bodies of the Roman Republic were two in number. The first and more important was the Senate. This was a body originally of patricians and then of prominent men of all sorts, who were summoned to it first by certain powerful officials, the consuls and censors. Like the British House of Lords, it became a gathering of great landowners, prominent politicians, big businessmen, and the like. It was much more like the British House of Lords than it was like the American Senate. For 3 centuries, from the Punic Wars onward, it was the center of Roman political thought and purpose. The second body was the Popular Assembly. This was supposed to be an assembly of all the citizens of Rome. When Rome was a little state 20 miles square, this was a possible gathering. When the citizenship of Rome had spread beyond the confines in Italy, it was an altogether impossible one. Its meetings, proclaimed by horn blowing from the Capitol and the city walls, became more and more a gathering of political hacks and city riffraff. In the 4th century B.C., the Popular Assembly was a considerable check upon the Senate, a competent representation of the claims and rights of the common man. By the end of the Punic Wars, it was an impotent relic of a vanquished popular control. No effectual legal check remained upon the big man. Nothing of the nature of representative government was ever introduced into the Roman Republic. No one thought of electing delegates to represent the will of the citizens. This is a very important point for the student to grasp. The Popular Assembly never became the equivalent of the American House of Representatives or the British House of Commons. In theory, it was all the citizens. In practice, it ceased to be anything at all worth consideration. The common citizen of the Roman Empire was therefore in a very poor case after the Second Punic War. He was impoverished. He had often lost his farm. He was ousted from profitable production by slaves, and he had no political power left to him to remedy these things. The only methods of popular expression left to a people without any form of political expression are the strike and the revolt. The story of the 2nd and 1st centuries B.C., so far as internal politics go, is a story of futile revolutionary upheaval. The scale of this history will not permit us to tell of the intricate struggles of that time, of the attempts to break up estates and restore the land to the free farmer, of proposals to abolish debts in whole or in part. There was revolt and civil war. In 73 B.C., the distresses of Italy were enhanced by a great insurrection of the slaves under Spartacus. The slaves of Italy revolted with some effect, for among them were the trained fighters of the gladiatorial shows. For 2 years Spartacus held out in the crater of Vesuvius, which seemed at that time to be an extinct volcano. This insurrection was defeated at last and suppressed with frantic cruelty. 6,000 captured Spartacists were crucified along the Appian Way, the great highway that runs southward out of Rome, 71 B.C. The common man never made head against the forces that were subjugating and degrading him, but the big rich men who were overcoming him were even in his defeat preparing a new power in the Roman world over themselves and him, the power of the army. Before the Second Punic War, the army of Rome was a levy of free farmers, who, according to their quality, rode or marched afoot to battle. This was a very good force for wars close at hand, but not the sort of army that will go abroad and bear long campaigns with patience. and moreover, as the slaves multiplied and the estates grew, the supply of free-spirited fighting farmers declined. It was a popular leader named Marius who introduced a new factor. North Africa, after the overthrow of the Carthaginian civilization, had become a semi-barbaric kingdom, the kingdom of Numidia. The Roman power fell into conflict with Jugurtha, king of this state, and experienced enormous difficulties in subduing him. Marius was made consul, in a phase of public indignation, to end this discreditable war. This he did by raising paid troops and drilling them hard. Jugurtha was brought in chains to Rome 106 BC, and Marius, when his time of office had expired, held on to his consulship illegally with his newly created legions. There was no power in Rome to restrain him. With Marius began the third phase in the development of the Roman power, the Republic of the military commanders. For now began a period in which the leaders of the paid legions fought for the mastery of the Roman world. Against Marius was pitted the aristocratic Sulla, who had served under him in Africa. Each in turn made a great massacre of his political opponents. Men were proscribed and executed by the thousand, and their estates were sold. After the bloody rivalry of these two and the horror of the revolt of Spartacus, came a phase in which Lucullus and Pompey the Great, and Crassus and Julius Caesar were the masters of armies and dominated affairs. It was Crassus who defeated Spartacus. Lucullus conquered Asia Minor and penetrated to Armenia, and retired with great wealth into private life. Crassus, thrusting further, invaded Persia and was defeated and slain by the Parthians. After a long rivalry, Pompey was defeated by Julius Caesar 48 BC and murdered in Egypt, leaving Julius Caesar sole master of the Roman world. The figure of Julius Caesar is one that has stirred the human imagination out of all proportion to its merit or true importance. He has become a legend and a symbol. For us he is chiefly important as marking the transition from the phase of military adventurers to the beginning of the fourth stage in Roman expansion, the early empire. For in spite of the profoundest economic and political convulsions, in spite of civil war and social degeneration, throughout all this time, the boundaries of the Roman state crept outward and continued to creep outward to their maximum about 100 AD. There had been something like an ebb during the doubtful phases of the Second Punic War, and again a manifest loss of vigor before the reconstruction of the army by Marius. The revolt of Spartacus marked a third phase. Julius Caesar made his reputation as a military leader in Gaul, which is now France and Belgium. The chief tribes inhabiting this country belonged to the same Celtic people as the Gauls who had occupied North Italy for a time, and who had afterwards raided into Asia Minor and settled down as the Galatians. Caesar drew back a German invasion of Gaul and added all that country to the empire, and he twice crossed the Straits of Dover into Britain, 55 and 54 BC, where, however, he made no permanent conquest. Meanwhile, Pompey the Great was consolidating Roman conquests that reached in the east to the Caspian Sea. At this time, the middle of the 1st century BC, the Roman Senate was still the nominal center of the Roman government, appointing consuls and other officials, granting powers and the like, and a number of politicians, among whom Cicero was an outstanding figure, were struggling to preserve the great traditions of republican Rome and to maintain respect for its laws. But the spirit of citizenship had gone from Italy with the wasting away of the free farmers. It was a land now of slaves and impoverished men, with neither the understanding nor the desire for freedom. There was nothing whatever behind these republican leaders in the Senate, while behind the great adventurers they feared and desired to control were the legions. Over the heads of the Senate, Crassus and Pompey and Caesar divided the rule of the empire between them, the first triumvirate. When presently Crassus was killed at distant Carrhae by the Parthians, Pompey and Caesar fell out. Pompey took up the republican side, and laws were passed to bring Caesar to trial for his breaches of law and his disobedience to the decrees of the Senate. It was illegal for a general to bring his troops out of the boundary of his command, and the boundary between Caesar's command and Italy was the Rubicon. In 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon, saying, "The die is cast," and marched upon Pompey and Rome. It had been the custom in Rome in the past, in periods of military extremity, to elect a dictator with practically unlimited powers to rule through the crisis. After his overthrow of Pompey, Caesar was made dictator first for 10 years and then, in 45 BC, for life. In effect, he was made monarch of the empire for life. There was talk of a king, a word abhorrent to Rome, since the expulsion of the Etruscans 5 centuries before. Caesar refused to be king, but adopted throne and scepter. After his defeat of Pompey, Caesar had gone on into Egypt and had made love to Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, the goddess queen of Egypt. She seems to have turned his head very completely. He had brought back to Rome the Egyptian idea of a god king. His statue was set up in a temple with an inscription to the unconquerable god. The expiring republicanism of Rome flared up in a last protest, and Caesar was stabbed to death in the Senate at the foot of the statue of his murdered rival, Pompey the Great. 13 years more of this conflict of ambitious personalities followed. There was a second triumvirate of Lepidus, Mark Antony, and Octavian Caesar, the latter the nephew of Julius Caesar. Octavian, like his uncle, took the poorer, hardier western provinces, where the best legions were recruited. In 31 BC, he defeated Mark Antony, his only serious rival, at the naval battle of Actium, and made himself sole master of the Roman world. But Octavian was a man of different quality altogether from Julius Caesar. He had no foolish craving to be god or king. He had no queen lover that he wished to dazzle. He restored freedom to the Senate and people of Rome. He declined to be dictator. The grateful Senate, in return, gave him the reality instead of the forms of power. He was to be called not king indeed, but princeps and Augustus. He became Augustus Caesar, the first of the Roman emperors, 27 BC to 14 AD. He was followed by Tiberius Caesar, 14 to 37 AD, and he by others, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, and so on up to Trajan, 98 AD, Hadrian, 117 AD, Antonius Pius, 138 AD, and Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 AD. All these emperors were emperors of the legions. The soldiers made them, and some the soldiers destroyed. Gradually, the Senate fades out of Roman history, and the emperor and his administrative officials replace it. The boundaries of the empire crept forward now to their utmost limits. Most of Britain was added to the empire. Transylvania was brought in as a new province, Dacia. Trajan crossed the Euphrates. Hadrian had an idea that reminds us at once of what had happened at the other end of the old world. Like Shi Huang Ti, he built walls against the northern barbarians, one across Britain and a palisade between the Rhine and the Danube. He abandoned some of the acquisitions of Trajan. The expansion of the Roman Empire was at an end. End of chapter 33.